Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Wade Bradford and I'm continuing my deep dive into Stephen King's On Writing. Today we're talking about the shortest part of the book, and that is a little chapter called What Writing Is, and we'll also talk about another brief chapter called The Toolbox. And if you're just joining us and you have no idea what this book is, Stephen King, an author famous for writing horror novels, also wrote this excellent guide to writing fiction. The first section of it talks about his early childhood, and then he gets into his adolescence and early professional experiences. I've already made a video that talks about those narrative experiences that he covers. You can find it by following this link if I'm technically competent enough to put it up there. And I'd also like to know if you value some of the advice as much as I do. Here are my favorite parts from the middle section of Stephen King's book. So smack dab in the middle of this, he gives us a little chapter called What Writing Is, and he gives us the answer, telepathy. That's right, telepathy. So the idea that your mind is sending thoughts into the mind of another person. He's talking about writing in a way that he can write this book back in 1997, and it can be picked up by someone 100, 200 years from now. And as long as that person knows the definitions of the English words that are transcribed onto the page, they're going to share some of the same, if not thoughts, the same ideas that a writer like Stephen King conveys onto the page. When we get to the toolbox portion, that's where he's giving very straightforward, practical advice. So Stephen King is talking about a toolbox, and he's talking about every sort of craft, every sort of occupation, you want to have some type of toolbox. And he starts off with sort of a little narrative from his childhood, talking about a relative, an uncle, if I remember correctly, and how you often need the right tool for the right job, but you don't always know what kind of tool you're going to need. So you take the toolbox with you, and that way if you need a hammer or a wrench, a saw or whatever, it's right there at your disposal. So Stephen King is saying, as writers, we want to have certain tools so that depending on what we're going to write, maybe it's just an email, maybe it's a college paper, maybe it's an epic novel, but we want to have the right tools for the job. So tool number one that he talks about is vocabulary. And the interesting thing that he says about vocabulary is, and I agree with this, you shouldn't stress over your vocabulary. And if you are writing a short story and you're writing a word and maybe you use a very basic word like good, and then you feel like, oh, that's not good enough, that's not excellent enough, that's not exquisite enough, or whatever you feel it is lacking, and you decide, well, I'm going to go to the synonym finder and I'm going to choose the biggest, fattest, longest word I can, the most complicated word, maybe a word I've never heard before, a word I've never seen, a word I don't know how to pronounce. That might not be the best word. You might not understand the context of the word, and there's a very good chance that you are writing down a very highfalutin word that your reader might not understand or connect with. Stephen King says that your vocabulary will increase as you continue to read. And that means that we don't need to stress about vocabulary. If we want to write the way we talk, if that's an effective way to tell a story, we can do that. We have permission from Stephen King and a lot of other English teachers, by the way. You have permission to do that. So work with the vocabulary you have. Keep reading books upon your shelf and elsewhere. That way you can naturally increase your vocabulary, or your lexicon, as I like to call it. Tool number two that Stephen King talks about is grammar, and he is tempted to go on to a long tirade of grammar, but he basically says, well, get those manuals to find out more about grammar. But since I am an English teacher, I will add to this. Many creative writers that I meet and connect with that are new to the process of writing a book or trying to get their work published, I do meet many creative writers that make these two mistakes. Mistake number one is run-on sentences. This often happens in the form of a comma splice. So a run-on sentence is not just a sentence that goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. In fact, you could write 100 pages and it could all be one sentence and it would be grammatically correct. I don't want to read that sentence, but you could make that happen and it would be grammatically correct. You just need to use a whole bunch of semicolons and conjunctions and commas and things like that. So if we're talking about a run-on sentence, that means that there are two independent clauses together, and they are together in an unholy matrimony of poor grammar usage. Meaning that, well, the example that I like to use is this. Here's a sentence that's a run-on sentence depending on how we write it. My dog is hungry, I should feed him. Now, if I say that all together with no punctuation, that's a run-on. It's a type of run-on called a fused sentence. My dog is hungry, I should feed him. And there's a very good chance that you already know that this is a run-on sentence. You can tell that it needs something. It needs some kind of punctuation mark to break things up. So many people, when they're writing this phrase, they might write this. My dog is hungry, comma, I should feed him. This, technically, is still a run-on sentence. It's not a fused sentence, but it is a comma splice error. So it's a type of run-on called a comma splice, and I see this very often, sometimes in professional writing, but usually I see it in the writing of my students and in the writing of creative writers that are, maybe they just never learned this, or maybe they don't care about it. So this comma splice error, it's an error because, not just because there's a comma there, but because it's a comma connecting two independent clauses. So we would want to have a comma and the word maybe so, right? My dog is hungry, comma, so I should feed him. That would work. That would work. If you feel like, well, no, I don't want to add any more words, then you could simply put, my dog is hungry, period. I should feed him. And if you feel like, no, these two messages, they belong together, don't separate them by a period, how dare you, Professor Bradford? Then use a semicolon, because a semicolon can do a couple things, and one of the most effective ways of using a semicolon is to use it to connect two complete sentences or two independent clauses, and you feel like they should be joined together in grammatical matrimony. There you go, use a semicolon. I've talked way too long about that. The other mistake that I see a lot are fragments. Fragments can be creative. So if you're using, fragments for creativity, and Stephen King talks about this, great, use fragments. Fragments can be very conversational, they can be very effective. So fragments aren't entirely a bad thing. And I suppose you could argue that run-on sentences aren't entirely bad, right? If you're having a character talk or a character narrate, maybe you want to have run-on sentences. Fragments can be useful, but it's a question of, do you know that it's a fragment? So if you're not sure what makes a complete sentence, brush up on this and find out what makes a fragment and what makes a complete sentence. So the good news is that if you are working with like Microsoft Word, or maybe you're using Grammarly, the free version of Grammarly, those programs look for grammatical errors. So pay attention to those little squiggly underlines. I think usually it's green or blue, or the red is the misspellings, right? Any sort of Word document, Google Docsy thing, they should be able to help you check for your grammar. So don't rush during the revision process. Pay attention to those little squiggly blue underlines. Wow, who would have thought we'd be talking about Stephen King and then just dive into grammar, right? Isn't this exciting? I love it so much. The third thing that Stephen King talks about, to be put in one's toolbox, is related to style. So style is kind of about choices that you are making consistently, maybe even subconsciously, as a writer that show up in the writing and that affect the maybe the flow in which the reader is absorbing your ideas. So style can be about sentence structure, and it could be about sentence variety. It could be about, word choices. So style covers a lot of things. And he mentions a few of his dislikes. So as a reader, he talks about what he doesn't like to see, and also what he tries to avoid as an author. And the strongest impression I get from Stephen King's text is that he does not like adverbs, right? Adverbs are those words that describe verbs. And he and many other people agree with this. He says that if you choose the right verb, you don't need to have the adverb. I think here he gives an example of when he has done this himself, because he says, yeah, I don't like to see this. in other people's writing. I don't like it in my own writing. Have I made this mistake before? Have I used way too many adverbs in my past work? Yes. He literally jokes and says, do as I say, not as I do. I think that this is an example. It's in bold, and he is claiming that this is one of his, quote, stupid lapses. And the quote is, "You can't be serious," Bill said unbelievingly. I don't know if that's a quote from Stephen King's It, but it might be, because there's the character named Bill, so maybe it's from that, I'm not sure. So that line, "You can't be serious," Bill said unbelievingly. So Stephen King, that would make him cringe, and I think it does, and that's why he's putting it in there, to let you know that he makes these mistakes as well. The word unbelievingly, that's an adverb. Doesn't need to be there. It doesn't stop me that much as a reader, but it stops Stephen King because he says it's as though the writer is afraid that the words on the page aren't quite enough to help the reader understand. And so that fear of writers, of not being understood, generates this overwhelming desire to put more adverbs, or for other people it might be, too much information, too many prepositional phrases or something like that, to try to get the reader to clearly understand what's going on the page. For fiction writers, Stephen King suggests that the adverb is not your friend, and that you should choose strong verbs and trust your reader more. Stephen King's other bit of advice here is really embraced by every English teacher I've ever met, and here it is. The active voice is superior to the passive voice. So writing in passive sentences can be useful at times, but for the most part you want to have active verbs, active sentences. Just in case you don't know what this means, here's an example of an active sentence. The mighty waves tossed the little boat. So the mighty waves, they are doing the action. They're performing the action, so that's an active verb. This is an active sentence. I could make it passive. The little boat was tossed by the mighty waves. Because we are focused on what is happening to the boat. That little boat is not really doing anything in that sentence. It's being tossed around by something else. So the subject, or the star of the sentence, the little boat, is having something done to it. So for the most part, sentences are going to be more vibrant, more compelling, if we are delivering active sentences to our readers. On the other hand, looking back at that sentence, if you really felt like, well, I want to show how this little boat is really the victim in this little storm with all the mighty waves, that might be a decent reason to have a passive sentence. So again, it all comes back to, do you know what you are doing? Whether it's fragments or whether it's adverbs or passive versus active, do you understand the differences? Do you understand what these stylistic elements are? And if you do, the more you understand, the more you will understand when you can and should break the typical rules. And one last thing that we can learn from this middle portion of Stephen King's book on writing is that he loves not just to write, but he loves to read. So we get a lot of instructions in here to go and grab a book off the shelf and look at it and get to know the paragraphs and how ideas are organized and how dialogue is used and how the language might be conversational, it might be formal, it might be natural. So really look at the books around you and start to analyze what you admire as a reader and try to bring those traits into your own writing. That's my overview of Stephen King's middle portion, the Toolbox, and his idea about telepathy. If you are reading along, I'd love to know your thoughts on this book. And if you agree or disagree with Stephen King and his advice on writing, please leave a comment and let us know what your thoughts are. Also, I'd love to know if there's anybody out there that would love to start a Stephen King sort of YouTube book club. I'm having a lot of fun reading this, but I would really like to get to reading his fiction and talking about some of our favorite Stephen King stories. There's probably a lot of booktube communities out there doing Stephen King. I hang out with the AuthorTube people most of the time, so I'll have to check on booktube. So if you'd like to start a Stephen King book club, let me know. Or if you already know of a cool YouTube Stephen King book club, let me know that too, and maybe I'll just follow along instead of making new videos. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and have fun writing!